Hey guys, it's Joel from guntoter.org. Coming back today, continuing our series on semi-automatic handgun fundamentals. Today we're going to talk about types of actions. So when I say action, for the purposes of this video and our discussion, an action is the parts of the gun that make it fire. So when we talk today, we're going to be particularly concerned with the trigger, the hammer, and the firing pin, or the trigger and the striker, depending on which model of gun we're talking about. There's gonna be a lot of definitions, a lot of technical stuff, and then I'll get to some of the more practical applications at the end. So definitions, let's just start knocking these out. First four definitions, we're gonna talk about double action, what is it, single action, what is a hammer fired gun, what is a striker fired gun. I've got examples here. So double action. When someone says double action, that means when you pull the trigger, two things happen. The hammer or striker is pulled to the rear, and then it is released to fire the gun. Someone says single action. It's one action. On a single action, the hammer or striker is typically already to the rear, so when you pull the trigger, all it does is release it, and that fires the gun. When we say hammer fired, that means that the firearm has a external hammer. When you pull the trigger, that hammer strikes the firing pin, which strikes the primer, and the gun fires. When we say striker fired, that means that there is no external hammer. There is an internal striker that is actually contained within the slide. When you pull the trigger, it acts directly on that striker, which strikes the primer and fires the gun. So that's double action, single action, hammer fired, striker fired. Now, within those kind of overarching categories, there are different configurations. So using the ever popular Beretta M9 here as an example, this is what they would call a double action, single action, or depending on who you talk to, it's a traditional double action. What that means is when you pull this gun out of your holster to use it, the first trigger pull is going to be double action. Every trigger pull after that is going to be single action. So, give you an example, double action. When I pull the trigger, because I pulled this out of my holster and I'm shooting at a target or whatever, you'll see as I pull the trigger, the hammer goes to the rear, and then at some point it releases, and the gun would fire. So that's double action. After that, as the gun fires and the slide reciprocates, it actually cocks the hammer. So now this gun is in single action. So when I pull the trigger, one thing happens, the hammer falls, the gun fires, and so on. So this is what they would call a traditional double action, single action. Obviously, as you look at this, you're like, okay, well, you fired the gun, you're done shooting, but it's still cocked. Good point. On a traditional double action or a double action, single action, what you'll normally find is a lever called a decocker. Now on the M9, it's actually this lever right here. On a Sig Sauer, their P series, they're 229, 226, 228, 225, 220. They typically have the decocker. It would be right here on the side, but they're going to have a decocker, and the reason for that is you want to go back to double action before you holster the gun and before you put it away. So in the case of the Beretta here, you just operate the lever down. Now it's in double action, right? So that is a double action, single action. Now, there are guns that are double action only, which means it never goes to single action. So every trigger pull is going to be. That's what a double action only is going to look like. One of the ways, if you're just trying to identify by sight, one of the ways you can sometimes identify a double action only gun is this hammer spur right here will actually be removed, because the reason for the hammer spur is to put it into single action, and if you're not going to do that, there's really no reason to have a hammer spur, is there? So a lot of times the hammer will actually sit flush with the slide. Some examples of this, there's actually Berettas that have that flush hammer. The SIG P250 actually is a double action only gun. And if you look at that, the hammer sits, flush with the slide. SIG had some other double action only guns. There's a lot of them out there. Smith & Wesson, actually, they're older metal frame guns. They had a lot of double action only guns. So that would be just an indicator. If you ever have a question about how your gun functions, what type of action it has, or anything else, including how to clean the thing, read a manual. Just by looking at the gun, you can get some pretty good clues as to how it works, but you're not going to get the full picture. That's why they make manuals. If your gun did not come with a manual, like if you bought it secondhand from somebody, go to the manufacturer's website. They usually have the manuals on there in PDF form. You can read them. Please read your manual. I know people hate hearing that, but please read your manual. All right, talked about double action, single action, talked about double action only. Now for one of my favorites, single action only. Probably the best example of this, the 1911. When we say single action only, it's kind of self-explanatory. This gun can only be fired from single action. So hammer's cocked, it's in single action, I pull the trigger, gun fires. Now, the hammer is down. Unlike the Beretta, where as you saw, I could pull the trigger and make it function, I can sit here and pull this trigger all day long and absolutely nothing is going to happen except I'm going to get irritated. The hammer must be cocked for a single action only gun to work. As I said, the 1911 is probably the best example. The Browning High Power is another excellent example. A lot of CZ guns fire from single action, although CZ guns are a little bit weird. They are not technically single action only because you can fire them in double action, but the majority of them, with the exception of their decocker, they have their decocker models and their standard models. Their standard models are really designed to be fired from single action, but can be fired from double action, whereas their decocker models are more the traditional double action, single action. So I do love CZs. Unfortunately, I don't have an example here to show you. So single action only, hammer must be cocked to fire. Double action, single action, first round is in double action. All the rounds after that are in single action. Double action only, there is no single action. It's always going to be double action every time you pull the trigger. Okay, so striker fired guns. Striker fired guns are a bit of an oddity because they don't have that external hammer. So there really isn't a hard and fast double action, single action in striker fired guns. I'll give you an example. So on a Glock, lots of people like to argue about this. I mean, if you're bored, which you might be because you're stuck at home on quarantine, if you're bored and you want to get on the internet and start a fight, yeah, feel free. The Glock. When you chamber around on a Glock, slide comes forward, the striker sits in kind of a weird, almost like a half-cock position. It's not forward, but it's also not fully to the rear. So when you pull the trigger on a Glock, two actions do happen. It actually pulls that striker to the rear and then releases it. Now, Glock calls this safe action, so they won't necessarily say that it's double action, but using the most basic definition, a Glock is a double action only gun because it can only be fired that way. Every time you pull the trigger, striker goes to the rear and then comes forward. Now, the SIG P320, which is their striker fired option, is much closer to a single action striker fired gun. When you work the slide and the round is chambered, the striker is actually fully cocked. So when you pull the trigger, the striker just goes forward. It doesn't really go to the rear and then go forward like the Glock. Now, why does all this really matter, right? Like, other than the fact that I want to make my gun go boom, why do I care about double action, single action, and so on? Well, the reason you need to care is because the type of action is going to determine kind of how the gun feels in your hand. And you can learn to shoot any gun well. It doesn't matter whether it's a double action only, single action only. You can learn to shoot it, and you can learn to shoot it well in a defensive or whatever situation. But the reason people care, and I'll go back to my M9 as an example, you can see where the trigger is here. So when people talk about trigger pulls, they talk about two things. They talk about length of pull or travel. There's other names, but basically, how far do I have to pull this trigger to make this gun go off? They also talk about the weight of the pull, meaning how many pounds of force do I have to apply to this trigger to make it travel that distance and make it go off. So on the Beretta, as you can see, it has to travel a pretty significant way to make it go off in double action. Now, remember where that trigger is right now. So in single action, see how much shorter that trigger travel is? And there's significantly less effort required to make it fire. So that is one reason why people get in big arguments, or why people might seek out a single action only gun, because it is much lighter and the travel is much shorter. And especially if you're going for accuracy, there's a reason that 1911s are super popular in the target shooting circuit. I don't mean like IPSC or IDPA, but the actual like target shooting circuit where you're going out to like 50 yards. It's because you can tune them, and that really short trigger pull means that there's less time for you to make some sort of error in your input into that gun and throw the round off. For defensive purposes, no matter which gun you pick, whether you pick a double action, single action, whatever, pick the gun that fits your hand and works for you, and then learn how to shoot it. Because if you learn how to shoot it, it doesn't really matter what action it has, as long as you know how to make it work, and you know how to make it work well. With that said, yes, there are significant differences between the two. I've fired a lot of guns over the years, and even in the striker fired with a Glock versus a P320, there is a significant difference in the feel. But the action and how the trigger pull feels is only one small part of the overall gun. There's a lot of other things that contribute to whether this gun is going to be a good gun for you. So know how the gun works, but take the entirety of the gun into consideration when you're picking a defensive firearm. All right, so after all that technical definition and talking, hope it's been useful for you. I know this is probably not the most thrilling subject, but I hope it's been useful for you. If it has, please go down, click like, click subscribe, click notifications. On social media, obviously, when we put out videos and so on and so forth, Facebook wants to get their money, right? So they limit your reach because they want you to pay for advertising. So if you could share this article, this video, organic shares really help us out. And if you have questions from this video, if anything I talked about, maybe wasn't clear or actually raised more questions, feel free to hit me up. You can hit me up on Facebook. You can hit me up through the email, which I will have down in the comments. You can hit me up Google Hangouts. You can hit me up, all sorts of ways. Leave a comment. I check the comments regularly and I try to respond. So the goal here is to get information to you, useful information to you. So if you have questions, please give me feedback. I can't make better videos if I don't know what questions people have. So thanks for watching, guys. It's been great. See you next time, and thanks for watching again.